Imagine being told that time itself, the very thing that rules every second of your life, doesn't exist in the way you think once you cross the threshold of death. That is exactly what Edgar Cayce revealed in some of his most striking readings. He described how the departed do not measure days, weeks, or years as we do on Earth. Instead, time is shaped by consciousness. For some spirits, moments stretch into what feels like centuries. For others, centuries vanish in the blink of an eye. In one of his sessions during the Great Depression, Cayce explained that the suffering of a restless soul could feel endless, while a soul in peace might pass through what we call 1,000 years, as if it were only a brief instant. This shattered the very idea of time being universal. Before I take you deeper into this mystery, I want to invite you to interact. Leave a comment telling us how you imagine time would feel after death. Do you think it would be slow, eternal, or instantaneous? Your perspective will add value to this discussion and connect you with others who are also searching for understanding. What makes this topic even more fascinating is the historical weight of Cayce's revelations. Picture Virginia Beach in the 1930s, a time of global economic despair. Families arrived at Cayce's modest office, carrying more than just financial worries. They came burdened with grief, desperate to know about loved ones who had passed. During one such session, Cayce slipped into his deep trance. His breathing slowed, and his voice transformed. He explained that the soul's experience of time is linked not to clocks, but to states of consciousness. The earthly mind is chained to sunrise and sunset, yet the spirit measures existence by growth, healing, or sometimes torment. A grieving widow once asked whether her husband waited for her in heaven. Cayce replied that in truth, her husband's soul could experience her arrival as immediate, because in eternity, waiting is not what we think it is. Such responses didn't just comfort families, they disrupted every assumption about how existence continues beyond the grave. What is striking is how these insights align with the way modern physics bends our understanding of time. While Einstein spoke of relativity in scientific terms, Cayce described relativity in spiritual terms decades earlier. He would say, "Time is but a shadow of eternity," and by this, he meant that what we experience here is only a pale imitation of what the soul perceives there. During the years of war in the 1940s, when so many were dying young, people wanted to know, were their loved ones lost in timeless wandering? Cayce emphasized that time was no prison. Instead, it was fluid, expanding, or contracting with the soul's awareness. One soldier's mother asked if her son, killed in battle, knew how long she suffered his absence. Cayce reassured her that for him, reunion would be immediate. The boundary between now and later dissolves once the soul leaves the body. This idea that eternity doesn't tick like a clock carries a challenge for us still alive. It means the way we value time here might be far more superficial than we realize. If a soul's torment makes moments last like centuries, then living with bitterness, anger, or guilt doesn't just affect us here. It shapes how long suffering feels after we die. On the other hand, cultivating peace, forgiveness, and spiritual awareness here might allow our soul to transcend time altogether. Imagine how different you would live if you knew that your choices today determine not only how your afterlife unfolds, but also how long it feels once you're there. This was the urgency behind Cayce's words, especially in those quiet evenings in Virginia Beach when families sat trembling in his small office. They weren't just hearing about a different world, they were hearing about the laws that would govern their own existence when their final day arrived. Cayce often reminded those who came to him that the biggest mistake we make on earth is to assume that time is absolute. He would emphasize that time is only an illusion of the material plane. In one of his most impactful readings from 1932, requested by a family grieving a child lost too soon, he explained that the boy's soul did not experience years of waiting for reunion. To the departed, love collapses time. The child's awareness of his parents was immediate, alive, and constant. This meant that while the parents felt the aching slowness of grief day after day, their son's soul perceived no such separation. For him, the next moment of embrace was already unfolding in eternity. This kind of teaching gave hope during an age of despair, yet it also forced people to rethink what death really is. It wasn't just the end of a clock's ticking. It was the release into a dimension where time bends, stretches, and dissolves into something the human brain can hardly grasp. During the Second World War, thousands of letters poured into Cayce's Virginia Beach headquarters. Mothers, wives, and children longed to know whether their loved ones who had perished overseas were waiting in anguish. Cayce's replies were astonishing. He said that what seemed like years of absence here on Earth could be, for the soul, the time of a single heartbeat. He often used metaphors that were deeply human. For instance, he compared earthly time to the shadow of a tree swaying in the wind. The shadow shifts constantly, but the tree itself, the eternal consciousness, remains steady. Just as shadows are temporary, so is our way of counting hours. The reality of the soul is beyond these measures. These words were not abstract philosophy. They came during sessions that determined how families understood their tragedies and how they would heal. Many left his office no longer fearing that their loved ones drifted alone in some endless corridor of waiting. Instead, they carried the certainty that reunion was always closer than they imagined. One of the striking things about Cayce's work is how he integrated this view of time with the idea of soul growth. He explained that while clocks and calendars vanish in the afterlife, development still matters. A soul who resists growth can feel what we would call delay. That delay is not counted in minutes or years, but in the weight of consciousness. Imagine being caught in regret so strong that each thought feels eternal. For that soul, progress can seem impossibly slow. By contrast, a spirit aligned with forgiveness and compassion can move forward as if timeless. This perspective brought urgency to how Cayce urged people to live. He would tell them that resentment and hatred didn't just poison the body, they trapped the soul in illusions of endless suffering after death. It was not punishment, but natural law. Consciousness itself shapes how long experience feels, whether painfully stretched or blissfully immediate. It is also remarkable how Cayce placed these teachings within a broader cosmic vision. He would sometimes speak of the soul's journey not only on Earth, but across different dimensions of existence. Here again, time was relative. In certain planes, what we call a millennium could pass in the blink of an eye. In others, what feels like a moment to us could unfold as a vast age for the soul. He made it clear that time is not universal, but experiential. Each plane of existence carries its own vibration, and with each vibration comes a different sense of duration. These insights weren't designed to satisfy curiosity alone. They were practical, meant to transform how we live in the here and now. Because if we accept that eternity does not count time as we do, then clinging to regret, fear, or bitterness here is like planting seeds of endless delay for our own spirit. That understanding changed how many of his followers approached their daily lives. Among the most profound moments in Cayce's career were those sessions when people asked about the interval between death and rebirth. They wanted to know, does the soul wait centuries before returning, or is reincarnation immediate? Cayce's answers carried a depth that startled even his longtime stenographer, Gladys Davis. He explained that the measure of waiting is not chronological, but vibrational. A soul that has unfinished lessons or unresolved desires may feel what seems like a long pause before returning to Earth. Yet another soul, ready and aligned, may pass through that interval almost instantly. He warned that asking how many years is the wrong question. Instead, the true inquiry should be, how much growth occurred in the soul's consciousness? For some, 1,000 years of human history might pass, while their soul experiences no delay at all. For others, only a few Earth decades may unfold, yet the soul feels trapped in a heaviness that seems eternal. In one documented case during the early 1940s, a woman grieving her father asked whether he had reincarnated already. Cayce, in trance, responded that the father's soul was still in a state of review, absorbing lessons from the life just ended. But Cayce clarified something extraordinary. For the father, this period did not feel like years of waiting. Rather, it was experienced as an eternal present, a process of understanding without the pressure of clocks. The woman later testified that this explanation lifted her fear, because it revealed that her father was not stuck in boredom or longing, but engaged in meaningful growth beyond time. Such stories became central to Cayce's legacy, reminding audiences that eternity is not a prison, but a classroom where the soul continues to evolve. This teaching also extended to what Cayce called the borderland states, the immediate hours and days after death. People were desperate to know what their loved ones were experiencing in those early stages. Cayce explained that in those first transitions, the soul often perceives time with intense distortion. Minutes can feel endless, particularly if the person clings to earthly attachments. Yet as the soul gradually releases its fears, time loses its grip. He described how guides, souls who have advanced further, often meet the newly departed and help them adjust to this new perception. Imagine stepping into a world where there is no sunrise or sunset, no ticking clock, only the rhythm of your own consciousness. That was the reality Cayce wanted people to prepare for, so they would not be caught in fear when the moment arrived. The implications for those still living were enormous. Cayce often said, "Prepare now, for how you live today is how you will meet eternity." If resentment makes a day feel heavy here, imagine what it would do when multiplied in a realm where time no longer passes in linear form. On the other hand, if love can make hours fly, then imagine how it might allow a soul to cross vast stretches of eternity, as if they were a single instant. His words transformed how people approached daily life. They realized that each choice, to forgive, to serve, to cultivate peace, was also shaping the very texture of their afterlife. For Cayce, the question was never, how many years will I wait, but what quality of eternity am I creating within myself? This radical view made his teachings not only mystical, but deeply practical, resonating with audiences then and still today. Cayce's descriptions of the spiritual planes revealed an even deeper mystery about time. He spoke of dimensions where the sense of duration nearly vanishes, and others where the experience of delay can be overwhelming. In the lower realms, often associated with unrest or attachment to earthly desires, souls sometimes report what feels like endless waiting. For example, in a reading given to a family struggling with a relative lost in despair, Cayce explained that the man's soul was perceiving time stretched into what seemed to him like centuries, even though only a few months had passed on Earth. The suffering magnified every moment, making them feel unbearably long. In contrast, in higher planes of light and harmony, 1,000 years could pass on Earth, yet the soul might experience it as only a fleeting instant. This was Cayce's way of teaching that consciousness is the true clock of the universe, and that the afterlife is shaped not by physical rotations of the earth, but by the vibrations of the spirit. During the 1930s and 40s, these revelations were not abstract ideas. They carried weight for families desperate to understand where their loved ones were. In Virginia Beach, people gathered in a small room while Cayce entered his trance, and through his voice, they heard answers that redefined their grief. A woman mourning her child was told that the child's soul did not feel the weight of years, but was already immersed in the reality of reunion. Another grieving man was reassured that his brother, killed in battle, had moved into a dimension where time was measured only by love and growth, not by days or months. The comfort came not from promises of quick return, but from the understanding that eternity was alive and present, not stretched out into a monotonous wait. Cayce's words showed that we must unlearn our obsession with calendars, because they belong only to the physical world. He even extended these teachings into the realm of reincarnation. When people asked whether they would meet loved ones again in the next life, Cayce explained that timing was not about Earth years but about readiness. Some souls might reincarnate quickly, because their lessons aligned with immediate return. Others might remain in spiritual realms for what, in Earth terms, would be centuries, yet in their own awareness, no sense of delay existed. This truth dismantled the idea of waiting as we know it. To the soul, existence was continuous and purposeful, without the boredom of counting hours. Each stage was an unfolding of consciousness, where past, present, and future blurred into a single movement of growth. Such a vision carried extraordinary implications. What we call history might be only a moment in eternity, and what we call a lifetime might be just a breath in the vast continuum of the soul. This insight challenged even those who came to Cayce with skepticism. Some questioned whether these teachings were comforting metaphors rather than truths, but Cayce always insisted that these were not inventions. He drew them from direct access to the Akashic records, which he described as a universal memory field, where every thought, action, and intention was recorded beyond time. There, he said, the soul can perceive all lifetimes at once, as though flipping through a book where every page is open simultaneously. Time, as we know it, disappears in that state of consciousness. Imagine walking into a library where all books are not arranged in sequence, but exist side by side, readable in a single glance. That was how Cayce portrayed the soul's experience beyond the veil. It was both a comfort and a challenge. A comfort because it meant nothing was ever truly lost, and a challenge because it meant our actions now echo across eternity in ways we can barely comprehend. For Cayce, the link between spiritual time and the Akashic records was inseparable. He described the records as a dimension outside of chronological sequence, where the soul could perceive all of its incarnations, lessons and choices simultaneously. In one session during the early 1930s, a client asked why he felt haunted by a fear that seemed older than his current life. Cayce explained that the fear was not only from childhood experiences, but also from choices in a previous incarnation. He then added something crucial. The soul was perceiving these memories outside of Earth's timeline, experiencing the past as though it were unfolding now. That was the essence of spiritual time, an eternal present in which the lessons of all lives remain accessible. This insight revealed why trauma, growth, and healing could transcend centuries. What we believe to be long ago is still alive in the vibration of the soul until it is resolved. Such teachings had practical consequences for people seeking guidance. Cayce urged his clients to see their struggles not as isolated moments, but as part of a continuous stream of growth. He would explain that if anger or resentment was not released here, it would follow the soul beyond death, making moments feel like endless burdens. Conversely, acts of kindness and forgiveness had the power to dissolve time, moving the soul swiftly into peace. One grieving mother, after hearing Cayce's words, remarked that she no longer feared the decades she might spend alone on Earth. To her, knowing that her child did not count time as she did, meant that reunion was not far away. It was immediate in the higher sense of eternity. This understanding reshaped how many people in Virginia Beach approached their daily lives. They began to see forgiveness, compassion, and spiritual practice not as optional virtues, but as preparation for navigating eternity itself. What is striking is that Cayce often framed these ideas using language his audiences could grasp in an age dominated by science and war. He compared the soul's perception of time to Einstein's relativity, saying that just as physical time bends with speed and gravity, spiritual time bends with vibration and consciousness. He warned that if humanity continued to think only in terms of mechanical clocks, it would miss the truth that existence itself was layered, multidimensional and timeless at its core. For those who asked how long until they would meet their loved ones again, Cayce answered in ways that broke the heart, yet healed it. To the soul, it is but a moment. That moment, he explained, could feel eternal if filled with regret, or instantaneous if filled with love. These revelations placed immense responsibility on each listener, for they realized that their choices in the present moment determined the very fabric of their eternity. By the time of the post-war years, Cayce's health was declining, yet his urgency about this subject grew stronger. In sessions given just before his death in 1945, he repeated that time on Earth is a training ground. Learning to value the present moment here is what prepares the soul to navigate eternity there. He encouraged people to practice stillness, prayer and meditation, not merely as religious acts but as exercises in stepping outside of time. In those moments of silence, he said, the soul could begin to taste what eternity felt like. It was in such practices that many of his followers reported glimpses of timelessness, moments where hours passed like seconds, or seconds expanded into infinite awareness. Cayce explained that these were not hallucinations, but authentic windows into the nature of the afterlife. They were hints that time as we know it was never the final truth, but only the shadow of something far greater. As Cayce moved into the final years of his life, His readings became even more direct about the dangers of attachment and ego after death. He explained that while time itself is not linear in the spiritual world, the illusions created by the mind can trap a soul in what feels like an endless cycle. In one striking session, he described how a man who had lived in bitterness carried that same state beyond the grave. Even though his earth life had ended, his consciousness clung to resentment so fiercely that every moment felt stretched into eternity. Cayce compared it to being locked in a room with one's own thoughts, unable to escape until forgiveness and release took place. This was not punishment from outside forces, but the natural consequence of carrying unresolved emotions into a dimension where clocks no longer distract or dissolve them. The soul itself becomes the measure of its own time. For those seeking comfort, these revelations were both sobering and liberating. On the one hand, Cayce warned that no one escapes the responsibility of consciousness. Whatever you cultivate in life becomes the fabric of your eternity. On the other hand, he assured his clients that transformation is always possible, even beyond death. Guides and higher souls, he said, assist the departed in releasing illusions and awakening to the eternal present. This process, however, can feel like centuries for those resistant to change. During the Great Depression, when despair weighed heavily on many families, Cayce's words helped them understand why cultivating peace and gratitude was vital not just for survival, but for eternity. The way you count time now, whether in worry or in trust, shapes how time will be experienced after your final breath. In one of his most emotional readings from the early 1940s, Cayce explained to a grieving widow that her husband, who had died in combat, did not feel the long years she feared. For him, reunion was immediate, because love collapsed the illusion of waiting. He told her that the prayers she whispered each night reached him instantly, not through distance, but through vibration. For the first time, she saw time not as separation, but as connection. Stories like these spread from Virginia Beach across America, inspiring countless individuals to rethink not only death, but the way they lived their daily hours. If eternity was shaped by vibration, then every choice of thought and emotion mattered. Each moment became practice for navigating a realm where time was no longer counted but created. Cayce's own words about his mission reveal why he placed such urgency on this subject. He said his gift was not only to diagnose illness or predict global events, but to help humanity prepare for eternity. That preparation meant realizing that time here is fleeting, but how you use it determines your experience beyond. He urged people to release bitterness, to forgive quickly, and to live with compassion, because these actions were the tools that freed the soul from the weight of false time after death. As his body weakened in 1944, he repeated to those close to him that he had seen beyond the clock of man, and that the truest freedom was discovering that eternity is now. This final lesson left an indelible mark on his followers, many of whom carried these words into their own spiritual practice for the rest of their lives. Today, Cayce's teachings about time remain more relevant than ever. In an age when we live by the clock, checking schedules, deadlines, and alarms, his voice echoes with a radical reminder: eternity is not measured in minutes. Modern seekers often revisit his archives in Virginia Beach and are stunned by how consistent his words were across decades. He never wavered. The afterlife does not unfold like a calendar. Instead, it responds to the vibration of the soul. Scientists now speak of time dilation, of relativity, of quantum states where past and future blur. But Cayce had already described this principle in spiritual terms long before physics gave it language. He showed that consciousness itself bends. Time and that after death, our inner state defines whether eternity feels like torment, peace, or instant reunion with those we love. This changes everything about how we live. If eternity is shaped by our inner life, then every act of forgiveness, every prayer, every moment of gratitude is not wasted. It is training for timelessness. For those who asked, "What happens to me when I die? How long will I wait?" Cayce offered the same response. The soul does not wait the way humans think. Waiting belongs to the body, to the rotation of earth and the movement of shadows. The soul moves in rhythms of growth and harmony, not in hours or years. And that means we carry immense power in the present moment. By choosing peace, we free ourselves not only here, but also in the eternal realms. By choosing resentment, we imprison ourselves in illusions of endless delay. This was Cayce's warning and his hope, that humanity would awaken before death to the truth that time is not a tyrant, but a mirror of consciousness. Those who grasped this teaching in his lifetime often testified that it transformed their grief, their fears, and even their illnesses. It gave them a reason to live differently today, because today was not just a day, it was eternity in motion. And so, as we close this exploration of Edgar Cayce's revelations, we must face the question he posed to every generation: how will you shape your eternity? If time after death is not measured by clocks but by the state of your soul, then every choice you make now builds the quality of your forever. Imagine carrying resentment into a realm where it stretches endlessly. Imagine carrying love into a realm where it collapses time into immediate reunion. That is the power you hold. Cayce's life from Hopkinsville to Virginia Beach, from the Great Depression through the war years, was dedicated to showing humanity that eternity is not later. It is now. His words still challenge us to see beyond the ticking of the clock and to recognize that the eternal present is already here, waiting for us to awaken. If this message touched you, take a moment to reflect. How do you personally imagine eternity? Does it feel like waiting, or does it feel like presence? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice may bring comfort to someone else who is searching for answers. And if you found value in these revelations, join our community by subscribing, sharing this video, and helping others discover the wisdom of Edgar Cayce. Because together, by exploring these mysteries, we prepare not just for death, but for life in its truest, eternal form. In one of his most impactful readings of 1932, Edgar Cayce said something that startled those present. Jesus was not only the Christ, but also the perfect example of how every soul is meant to embody the Christ consciousness. Imagine the shock of hearing those words in a time when most churches taught that Jesus was entirely separate from humanity. Cayce wasn't denying Jesus' divinity. He was revealing the hidden link that few dared to acknowledge. The Christ is both the eternal Spirit of God and the destiny planted in every soul. To Cayce, Jesus demonstrated that union fully, but he also came to show us that the same awareness waits within each of us. This was a revelation that comforted those who had lost hope during the Great Depression and challenged religious leaders who wanted to keep the Christ as an unreachable figure. Cayce insisted that the real message of Jesus was not worship me, but follow me, and you will discover the same light. And that link between Jesus and the Christ consciousness is what he believed would one day transform the world. Before we go deeper, let me ask, what would change in your life if you truly believed that the same divine awareness that lived in Jesus is waiting to awaken in you? Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because this conversation is meant for the entire world. Cayce explained this hidden link again and again during sessions that transformed people's lives. In Virginia Beach, families came seeking healing for illnesses, guidance in crises, and hope in despair. And time after time, Cayce connected their struggles to the same truth. The Christ consciousness is the answer, and Jesus is the model. He taught that prayer is how we align our hearts with God, meditation is how we listen to the inner voice, forgiveness is how we dissolve barriers, and service is how we make the divine real in the world. Each of these steps mirrors the way Jesus lived, and that is why Cayce said Jesus is the pattern, the living map of our spiritual evolution. He described the Christ consciousness as the universal awareness of oneness with God, and Jesus as the one who reached that state completely. This does not diminish Jesus' role, instead it magnifies it, because it means his life is not a distant story, but a mirror held up to our own souls. But here is what nobody expected. Cayce revealed that the Christ consciousness existed long before Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. He described it as the eternal Spirit of God moving through creation, guiding humanity across ages. Jesus, in his words, was the full and perfect embodiment of that Spirit in human form. That means the Christ is not confined to one moment in history. It is a living presence that continues to call each soul forward. For Cayce, this was the missing key that connected faith to destiny. He said that Jesus' mission was not only to redeem, but to reveal, to show us that we, too, carry the Christ pattern within. This teaching was radical because it shifted the focus from believing in Jesus alone to following his example and awakening the same awareness. It transformed the way people saw their purpose. No longer was life just about survival, wealth, or comfort. The true goal, according to Cayce, was to awaken the Christ within and live it out daily just as Jesus did. This discovery challenged both science and religion of his time. Scientists dismissed Cayce as uneducated and unqualified, while many religious leaders saw his words as dangerous. Yet the people who sat with him in Hopkinsville or Virginia Beach testified that his readings changed their lives in ways no sermon ever had. He described illnesses that doctors couldn't explain, gave guidance that brought peace in impossible situations, and always pointed back to the same truth. The Christ consciousness is real, and Jesus is the perfect link to it. And what happened next defied all logic. As people applied these teachings, meditating, forgiving, serving, they reported not only inner peace but also physical healings and reconciled relationships. For them, the Christ consciousness was not theory. It was powerfully alive. And Cayce reminded them that this was exactly what Jesus promised when he said, "You will do even greater things than I have done." When Cayce spoke about the hidden link between Jesus and Christ consciousness, he often emphasized that Jesus was the first to fully embody the pattern, but not the last. He explained that Christ is the eternal awareness of oneness with God, while Jesus was the man who perfectly manifested that awareness in the world. In one of his sessions during the 1930s, Cayce shocked listeners when he said, "The Christ is universal, but Jesus became the perfect channel for it." For many, this broke open a new way of thinking. It meant that Jesus was not distant, unreachable, or meant only to be worshipped. He was the living model of what is possible for all humanity. Cayce urged people to look at the way Jesus lived, his compassion, his forgiveness, his service, his courage, and to understand that these were not just acts of divinity, but demonstrations of what awakened humanity looks like. This was the link. Jesus embodied the Christ fully so that we could see the path and follow it. But here's where it becomes even more extraordinary. Cayce taught that this link explains why Jesus' words and actions carried such timeless power. He said that when Jesus forgave, healed, and loved unconditionally, he was not operating from human strength, but from Christ consciousness flowing through him. And he told seekers that the same flow is available to them when they align themselves with God through prayer, meditation, and service. This was not meant as poetic inspiration, it was meant as practical truth. During the Second World War, when people came to Cayce in despair, he often reminded them that the presence of Christ is not limited by time or space. He said that by awakening to that presence within, they could find peace even when the world outside was in chaos. And many testified later that they experienced exactly that. An inner calm that could not be shaken, even while bombs were falling and loved ones were missing. Still, Cayce was careful to point out that awakening the Christ consciousness is not automatic. He said that while every soul carries the spark, it can remain hidden under layers of selfishness, fear, and material obsession. Jesus, he explained, was the one who showed us how to remove those barriers completely. By forgiving his enemies, serving without seeking reward, and remaining faithful even in suffering, Jesus demonstrated the practices that strip away the ego and reveal the Christ within. This is why Cayce insisted that Jesus is not only Savior, but teacher, the one who not only redeems but instructs us in how to live. In this sense, the hidden link is not just theological, but deeply practical. Jesus is both the proof and the path of Christ consciousness. And for those who listened, to Cayce, this realization changed everything. Suddenly, faith was no longer about waiting for heaven after death, but about living heaven here and now through awakened awareness. What happened next surprised even the skeptics. People who began applying Cayce's guidance, meditating daily, forgiving old grudges, serving others quietly, reported not only inner peace but also external transformation. Relationships healed, health improved, and new opportunities opened. Cayce explained that this is the natural result of living in Christ consciousness. When we align with divine love, life itself begins to realign around us. He compared it to tuning an instrument. When the soul is tuned to the Christ, the music of life becomes harmonious. And he warned that when we refuse this tuning, discord grows. Nations fight, families divide, and individuals fall into despair. The hidden link between Jesus and Christ consciousness, then, was not meant as a theological curiosity. It was a call to live differently, to embody love so fully that the world itself is changed. For those who heard it, this was more than comforting words. It was a revelation that gave purpose and direction to their lives. Cayce also connected this hidden link to the soul's eternal journey. He explained that each soul carries the Christ pattern within. But through lifetimes of choices, experiences, and struggles, that awareness becomes clouded. Jesus, he said, was the one who cleared away every shadow, embodying the pattern perfectly. And in doing so, Jesus became the bridge that shows all souls the way back to God. This insight was radical in its time. In the 1930s and 40s, when most sermons emphasized human unworthiness, Cayce was declaring human potential. He wasn't denying sin or weakness. He acknowledged them as real obstacles, but he insisted that within each soul was the same light that guided Jesus. The hidden link, then, was this: Jesus is not separate from humanity, but the ultimate expression of what humanity can become. For listeners struggling with guilt or despair, this message was liberating. It told them that their lives had meaning far beyond survival or success. Their true destiny was to awaken the Christ within. One of the most powerful aspects of this teaching was how it transformed suffering. Cayce reminded people that Jesus faced pain, betrayal, and death itself, yet he responded with forgiveness and love. This, he explained, was Christ consciousness in action, the ability to see beyond the immediate wound and remain aligned with God. And he told seekers that they too could transform suffering if they chose to respond with love. In one session that deeply moved a family, Cayce said that their hardships were not punishments, but opportunities to awaken. By holding to faith and practicing forgiveness, they could turn pain into power. This reframing gave people a sense of purpose, even in their darkest hours. During the war years, when loss touched almost every home, this teaching gave families a way to endure. They could see their suffering not as meaningless chaos, but as part of the soul's path toward awakening the same awareness Jesus lived. But here's what nobody expected. Cayce said that this link between Jesus and Christ consciousness was also the key to humanity's future. He explained that if individuals awakened to this awareness, society itself would change. Wars, divisions, and injustices, he warned, are symptoms of forgetting the Christ within. When nations act from fear and greed, they invite destruction. But when people begin to live from Christ consciousness, through forgiveness, service, and love, those same forces of destruction lose their power. He even suggested that global peace would only come when enough individuals lived as Jesus lived, embodying the Christ fully in their daily lives. This was a staggering claim because it placed responsibility not on governments or institutions, but on ordinary souls. Each act of love, each choice for forgiveness, each moment of meditation, he said, contributes to a larger awakening that can transform the world. Cayce also confronted the objections directly. Many asked him, "Doesn't this teaching make Jesus just another man?" His answer was always clear: no, it makes him the greatest man because he fulfilled the divine destiny perfectly. Cayce insisted that Jesus was unique, not because he had a privilege we lack, but because he completed the journey we are all called to walk. In this way, Jesus' greatness becomes even more profound, because it shows us not only what God can do, but what humanity can become when united with God. The hidden link is that Jesus is both our Savior and our example, the one who shows us that salvation is not just believing in him, but becoming like him. This was Cayce's boldest claim, and it is why his words still provoke both resistance and inspiration today. For those willing to listen, it unlocks a new vision of faith, one that is not passive, but transformative. Cayce often used simple but profound metaphors to describe this hidden link. He would say that Jesus was like the perfect lens through which the light of Christ shone without distortion. The Christ, he explained, is eternal and universal. But in most of us, the light bends, scatters and weakens as it passes through the fog of selfishness, fear and doubt. In Jesus, the lens was clear. Every action, every word, every thought aligned perfectly with God. That is why Jesus could say, "I and the Father are one." Cayce wanted people to understand that this was not an unreachable state, but the model for humanity's true destiny. The task of life, then, is to polish our lens through prayer, meditation, forgiveness, and service, until the Christ shines as brightly in us as it did in him. And this vision changed everything. It shifted faith from worshipping at a distance to living as participants in the same divine reality. For those who heard it, this was not just theology, it was an invitation to transformation. He also pointed out that Jesus himself taught this truth. In one reading, Cayce reminded listeners of the moment when Jesus said to his followers, "You are the light of the world." This, he explained, was not poetry or encouragement. It was literal truth. Jesus was declaring that the same light he embodied also dwelled in them. The hidden link was always there in Scripture, but Cayce's readings brought it into focus, in a way people could not ignore, and what followed was extraordinary. Men and women who began living with this awareness reported that their lives changed in dramatic ways. Anxiety gave way to peace, illnesses improved, families reconciled. Cayce explained that these were not miracles in the sense of breaking natural law. They were the natural results of aligning with the deepest law of all, the law of love. Jesus lived it perfectly, and Cayce urged everyone else to begin living it step by step. But here is where Cayce introduced another powerful idea. He said that the Christ consciousness is not only personal, but cosmic. It connects us not only to God, but to every other soul. When Jesus embodied the Christ fully, he became the bridge not only between humanity and God, but also between humanity and itself. This is why, Cayce explained, Jesus prayed for unity, that they may all be one as you, Father, are in me and I in you. For Cayce, this was the hidden link revealed. Jesus was the demonstration that all souls are already connected through Christ, and until humanity awakens to this truth, division and conflict will continue. But once awakened, we will discover that we are not isolated beings, but expressions of one divine reality. This vision is as urgent today as it was in Cayce's time. It calls us not only to personal awakening, but to collective transformation. Cayce also emphasized that this hidden link between Jesus and Christ consciousness gives meaning to the soul's struggles across lifetimes. He explained that each incarnation is an opportunity to remove the obstacles that block the light of Christ within us. Mistakes are not final condemnations, but lessons that, when understood, bring us closer to the pattern Jesus demonstrated. He often told seekers that they had lived before, and that the challenges they faced in the present were connected to unresolved lessons from the past. In one session that shocked a family, he revealed that their constant conflicts were echoes of choices made in earlier lives, and that forgiveness in the present could break the cycle. This teaching was revolutionary because it showed that Christ consciousness is not only about one lifetime, but about the soul's eternal journey. Jesus, then, was not only Redeemer, but also way-shower across ages, proving that no matter how many times we fall, the Christ within us calls us back to God. For people weighed down with guilt or regret, this message opened a door of hope that nothing else could. He also connected this link to the destiny of nations. Cayce explained that just as individuals carry the Christ within, so do societies reflect or ignore this awareness. When nations act in fear, greed, or violence, they block the Christ pattern and bring destruction on themselves. But when they act in service, compassion, and cooperation, they reflect the same love Jesus embodied. This was not theory for Cayce. He warned repeatedly during the war years that humanity's survival depended on whether it chose to live by Christ consciousness. He said the hidden link between Jesus and this awareness was the key to peace. Not treaties, weapons, or power, but a collective awakening to the divine within. His words were a challenge to leaders and citizens alike, reminding them that the path to a new world lay not in conquest but in love. For many, this shifted how they saw their role in society. They realized that their personal awakening was part of a much larger plan for humanity. And yet, Cayce always brought the teaching back to the practical level. He reminded people that awakening the Christ within is not about dramatic revelations or mystical visions. It is about daily choices. He urged seekers to begin every morning in prayer, to meditate regularly, to forgive those who had wronged them, and to serve wherever they could. These were the tools Jesus used, and they remain the path for us. The hidden link is revealed in action, not theory. Cayce explained that every time we choose love instead of fear, every time we place another's needs before our own, every time we open our hearts in prayer, we awaken more fully to the same awareness Jesus embodied. He warned that without these daily practices, the Christ within remains dormant, but with them, it grows stronger until it transforms not only the individual, but everyone around them. This is how, Cayce said, the world itself will one day be renewed. In the final years of his life, Cayce spoke with even greater urgency about this hidden link. He insisted that humanity stood at a crossroads, and that the only true hope for the future was for enough souls to awaken to the Christ consciousness that Jesus revealed. He explained that technology, politics, and wealth could never solve the deepest problems of the world because they operate only on the surface. The real transformation must come from within, from the recognition that the same divine light that lived fully in Jesus is alive in each of us. He told seekers that the more they lived in alignment with this truth, the more they would see healing in their families, peace in their communities, and even balance in the natural world. The Christ consciousness, Cayce said, is not an idea to admire but a power to embody. And Jesus remains the eternal reminder that it can and must be done. For many who studied his readings, this changed everything. They began to see their spiritual lives not as a duty to appease God, but as an opportunity to become like Christ. They discovered that Jesus' promise, the kingdom of God, is within. Was not metaphor but reality. Cayce showed them that the hidden link between Jesus and Christ consciousness is the key to understanding who we are, why we are here, and what we are meant to become. And this realization brought courage, because it meant no one is left out. No matter your past, your background, or your struggles, the Christ pattern is in you, waiting to awaken. Jesus embodied it perfectly, but he also opened the door for you to follow. That is the link. Jesus is not only the one who showed the Cayce, he is the way. And so we are left with a question that Cayce asked again and again. What will you do with the Christ consciousness within you? Will you let it remain hidden under fear and selfishness, or will you awaken it through prayer, meditation, forgiveness, and service? The answer is not only about your life, it is about the future of humanity. Because Cayce believed that the fate of the world rests not in governments or armies, but in awakened souls who live as Jesus lived. If this message has stirred something in you, share it now, join this community, and commit yourself to living the Christ pattern. For as Cayce reminded us, it is not what we believe that transforms the world. It is what we live. Jesus lived, the Christ fully. The hidden link is that we are called to do the same. Imagine this. During the Great Depression, when millions of Americans were desperate for hope, Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, lay down in a small room in Virginia Beach, entered a trance state, and revealed something so extraordinary that it shook even the most skeptical minds. He spoke of what he called the Christ consciousness, not as a distant theological concept, but as a living, practical reality accessible to every soul. This was not about a religion or a creed. It was about awakening to the same divine awareness that Jesus himself embodied. And what Cayce revealed in those moments went far beyond the doctrines of his time. He said that the Christ consciousness was the highest state a human could attain, the true pattern of our spiritual destiny. In one of his most impactful readings of 1932, he described it as the universal awareness of the oneness with God that Jesus perfectly lived. This was the cornerstone of Cayce's message, and it terrified those who wanted to reduce spirituality to ritual while inspiring countless people who were starving for truth. Before we go deeper, let me ask, how would your life change if you realize that this same power lives in you right now? Stay with me, because what Cayce uncovered will transform how you see yourself and your connection to the divine. And if this message already touches you, leave a comment right now telling us where you are watching from. Let's see how far this truth can spread across the world. Cayce never spoke lightly about Jesus. To him, Jesus was not just a figure in history, but the perfect demonstration of what humanity could become. He explained that Jesus reached the fullness of the Christ consciousness, the model for every soul to follow. This wasn't a privilege of one man, but a calling to all of us. During sessions that changed entire families' lives, Cayce would remind them that the Christ within is not symbolic but literal. He taught that every time we forgive, love unconditionally, or serve others selflessly, we are aligning ourselves with this higher state of awareness. Imagine hearing those words in the 1930s, when churches were divided and society was collapsing under poverty. Cayce's voice stood out because it was not speculation. It came from readings that consistently offered profound healing, guidance, and clarity. People traveled from New York, Ohio, and even California to Virginia Beach, desperate to know how to live closer to God. And time after time, Cayce's answer revolved around this central teaching. Jesus showed us what it means to live in Christ consciousness, and each of us is invited to do the same. But here is what nobody expected. Cayce said that Christ consciousness is not something we must earn through rituals, but something we awaken by aligning with God's laws written in our own hearts. He insisted that prayer and meditation were not just religious practices, but gateways into this awareness. During the Second World War, when families feared losing their loved ones, Cayce encouraged them to practice what he called the presence of Christ. He explained that when we meditate, we are not merely calming our minds. We are tuning into the same universal field of awareness that Jesus fully embodied. That claim went beyond what many churches could accept. Yet for those who practiced, the results were undeniable. Peace in the midst of chaos, guidance in moments of confusion, and healing where doctors had no answers. And still, Cayce warned that this was not magic. It required daily effort, humility, and service to others. The Christ consciousness, he said, is the balance of spirit and matter, the harmony of love expressed in every action. Now let's investigate step by step how Cayce built this vision. He began with the human soul's journey through countless lifetimes, each experience shaping our growth toward this divine awareness. While science scoffed, Cayce described in detail how souls evolve and how Jesus represented the final stage of that evolution, the perfect example of humanity united with God. He revealed that Christ consciousness is not locked away in heaven. It is the seed already planted within every soul. And here comes the revelation that still shocks people today. Cayce stated that the purpose of life itself is to awaken this awareness. Nothing less. Not wealth, not status, not even health. Though all these could follow. But the true aim of existence was to realize the Christ within. For the average person in Virginia Beach hearing this in the 1940s, it was revolutionary. Imagine being told that the same force that guided Jesus also pulses in your own soul, waiting for recognition. That is the legacy Cayce left for the modern world. This discovery forces us to ask a hard question. If Christ consciousness is within us, why do so many fail to experience it? Cayce's answer was clear. He said that selfishness, fear, and material obsession block the light of this higher state. He urged people to live by the simple but demanding law of love, treating others as you would be treated, serving without expectation, and practicing forgiveness. These were not moral rules to keep people in line. They were spiritual technologies to awaken divine awareness. And here lies the contrast that disturbed theologians of his time. Cayce dared to say that salvation is not only about believing, but about becoming. Belief is the beginning, but transformation is the goal. In one reading, he said plainly, "The Christ comes into the world not only to show the way, but that each soul may become aware of that oneness." When Edgar Cayce spoke about the Christ consciousness, He wasn't introducing a new religion or a hidden doctrine. He was pointing to a universal truth that could be lived by anyone, regardless of their faith background. He often reminded people that Jesus himself declared, "You will do even greater things than I have done," a statement that most churches avoided taking literally. Cayce, however, interpreted it as an open invitation for every soul to awaken to this higher state of being. He explained that the Christ consciousness is not exclusive but inclusive. It is the divine spark within every human being waiting to be expressed. During sessions in Virginia Beach, families would come with illnesses, crises, and unbearable worries. In his trance state, Cayce would not only provide practical guidance for health or life decisions, but would frequently tie their struggles back to one central truth. Alignment with the Christ consciousness would bring them the peace and direction they sought. And this wasn't abstract. He gave concrete steps: prayer each morning, meditation to quiet the mind, forgiveness of old wounds, and acts of service as daily disciplines. These were not rituals for salvation. They were tools to awaken awareness. One striking moment came during a session in the 1930s, when a man devastated by the loss of his business during the Great Depression asked for hope. Cayce, in trance, did not promise him financial restoration. Instead, he told him that his true wealth would come when he realized the Christ consciousness living within. He explained that abundance flows when we align with the laws of love and service. The man, at first confused, later testified that this teaching redirected his entire life. He rebuilt not just his career but his family's spiritual foundation, claiming that what Cayce offered was not a prediction but a transformation. Cases like this spread quickly, and soon people from across the nation wanted to know, what exactly is this Christ consciousness and how can we live it? This hunger for understanding was so great that even skeptics who once dismissed Cayce as a fraud began paying attention, because the fruit of these teachings could not be denied. But here's where Cayce's vision broke boundaries. He connected the Christ consciousness not just to personal transformation but to the evolution of humanity itself. He said that the soul's journey through multiple incarnations was not random. Each life, each challenge, each relationship was designed to move us closer to this universal state of awareness. And Jesus, according to Cayce, represented the perfect fulfillment of that journey. A human being so fully aligned with God that he became the living example of what is possible for every soul. This was a staggering claim in an America still deeply shaped by rigid denominational divides. Yet Cayce grounded it in spiritual law, not speculation. He explained that every act of kindness, every moment of selflessness, every choice for forgiveness was evidence of the Christ consciousness breaking through. And over time, he said, this awareness could grow so strong that it transforms not only individuals, but entire communities and even nations. Still, the question remained, how do we access this state in daily life? Cayce gave an answer that was both simple and demanding. He urged people to live as Jesus lived, not just to worship him. He taught that each thought carries creative power, and when directed toward love and unity, those thoughts expand the Christ consciousness in the world. Meditation, Cayce insisted, was not optional but essential. He described it as tuning into the frequency of God, opening the inner ear to the same divine voice that guided prophets and saints. In one of his wartime sessions, when mothers in Virginia Beach were desperate for word of their sons fighting overseas, Cayce reminded them that by entering meditation and prayer, they were not powerless. They could create a field of love that touched those on the battlefield. And some of those families later claimed that they felt moments of peace or sudden clarity during prayer, as if their loved ones were protected. For them, Cayce's words weren't theory, they were lifelines. And what happened next defied all expectation. As people practiced these teachings, many reported healing not just of the body, but of relationships, inner fears, and even generational wounds. Cayce explained that this is what Jesus meant when he said the kingdom of God is within you. It is not a future reward, it is a present reality waiting to be discovered. That reality, the Christ consciousness, becomes the blueprint for a new way of life, one that no longer reacts with fear but responds with love. And Cayce warned that the greatest danger to humanity was not war, famine, or disease, but forgetting this truth. He insisted that every soul has the responsibility to awaken, because when we fail, we allow separation and hatred to dominate. Yet, when we succeed, even in small ways, we contribute to a transformation that ripples across the world. During the years of the Second World War, when fear and uncertainty dominated American households, Edgar Cayce's message about the Christ consciousness became even more urgent. Families gathered around radios for news of battles overseas, but many also gathered around Cayce in Virginia Beach for a different kind of guidance. They wanted to know if their loved ones would return, if their communities would survive, and if there was any hope in the face of destruction. Cayce did not always give them the answers they wanted, but he gave them something deeper, a reminder that the Christ consciousness was a living presence that could sustain them in their darkest hours. He explained that while nations might rise and fall, the Spirit of Christ remains eternal, available to every soul who seeks it. His words provided a kind of invisible armor. People left his sessions not with certainty about the future, but with a strength that helped them endure whatever came. And decades later, many would look back and say that what Cayce offered was not escape from reality, but the power to face it with faith and courage. Now here is where the story becomes even more profound. Cayce linked the Christ consciousness not just to survival or comfort, but to the ultimate evolution of the soul. He described humanity as being on a long journey, stretching back through countless incarnations, with one singular purpose, to awaken to our unity with God. Jesus, he said, was the living model of this fulfillment. In one of his most impactful readings of the early 1930s, he stated that Jesus had perfectly aligned with the divine will, showing us that this same destiny belongs to every soul. This teaching was not meant to diminish Jesus, but to magnify his role as the way shower, the one who reveals what is possible. Cayce urged his listeners to stop seeing Jesus as unreachable, and instead begin living in a way that followed his pattern. This was the essence of Christ consciousness, not worshipping from afar, but embodying the same love, compassion, and service in daily life. And for many who heard it, this turned their entire spiritual world upside down. But Cayce also confronted the obstacles head-on. He warned that selfishness, material obsession, and fear act as veils that hide the light of Christ consciousness within us. These were not just moral failings, they were energetic blocks that kept the soul trapped in lower vibrations. To break through them, he insisted on practices that were simple but life-changing: daily prayer to align with God's will, meditation to quiet the restless mind, acts of service without expectation of reward, and forgiveness that dissolves bitterness. He repeated over and over that these disciplines were not optional, they were the path. And again he tied this not only to personal well-being, but to the destiny of humanity as a whole. He believed that the future of civilization depended on whether enough souls would awaken to this consciousness and begin living it out. And when you consider how divided the world was during the war, it's easy to see why he placed so much urgency on this message. What makes Cayce's teaching even more extraordinary is how practical it was. He did not confine the Christ consciousness to sermons or theological debates. He wove it into the everyday struggles of ordinary people. If someone came with illness, he reminded them that true healing flows from aligning body, mind, and spirit with the Christ within. If someone came with fear of death, he assured them that awakening to this awareness removes the sting of mortality, because the soul recognizes its eternal nature. If someone came with family conflict, he pointed them back to love and forgiveness as the true solutions. Again and again, his readings revealed that the Christ consciousness was not a lofty idea. It was the missing key to every human problem. And those who applied it discovered changes that went beyond what medicine or psychology could explain. But here is the moment that shocked even his followers. Cayce declared that the Christ consciousness is not limited to Christians. He explained that it is a universal principle, the pattern of divine awareness available to every soul, regardless of culture or creed. Jesus was the perfect example, but the consciousness itself belongs to all humanity. This challenged deep-rooted dogmas, but it also opened the door to a new vision of unity. Cayce believed that one day the world would recognize this truth and that when it did, wars would cease and divisions would collapse. He foresaw a future where people of every nation would live not in competition but in cooperation, guided by the same inner awareness. And though that vision remains a challenge even today, it continues to inspire those who study his work. For them, the Christ consciousness is not a dream. It is the next step in the evolution of the human spirit. As the years passed, Edgar Cayce's insistence on the Christ consciousness as humanity's ultimate goal only grew stronger. In the post-war era, when America was entering a period of prosperity but also spiritual confusion, his message carried a quiet but piercing challenge. Material wealth could never replace spiritual awakening. He saw clearly that many people were chasing comfort while ignoring the deeper hunger of the soul. Cayce would say in his readings that the Christ consciousness is not about escaping the world, but transforming it through the way we live. He reminded seekers that Jesus walked among fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary men and women, not to elevate himself, but to show that the divine could live in every heart. That reminder landed with enormous power in the 1950s and 60s, when society was rapidly changing. Some came to Virginia Beach expecting mystical secrets about lost civilizations or prophecy, and while Cayce often touched on those subjects, he never allowed the central theme to be forgotten. The purpose of every life is to realize the Christ within. One of the most moving aspects of Cayce's work was how he connected the Christ consciousness to love in action. He explained that it is not enough to sit in meditation or hold private beliefs. This awareness must be expressed in how we treat others. He said that whenever we choose kindness instead of cruelty, forgiveness instead of revenge, or generosity instead of greed, we are living evidence of the Christ consciousness at work. And he never sugarcoated the difficulty of this path. In his words, the greatest battles are fought not on foreign soil, but inside the human heart, between selfish desire and divine will. That struggle, he said, is where each soul decides whether to remain asleep or awaken. He warned that no sermon, no ritual, no authority could do this for us. It is an inner choice, repeated daily. And while that responsibility may feel heavy, Cayce insisted it was also the greatest privilege given to the human soul. Now here's the turning point that startled many who heard it. Cayce claimed that even science would one day confirm the reality of this higher state of consciousness. He suggested that as research into the mind and energy fields advanced, humanity would discover that thoughts and emotions have measurable effects on the body and the world around us. What he described in trance, long before modern studies on meditation, neuroplasticity, and heart-brain coherence, was the idea that the Christ consciousness is not a mystical abstraction, but a real field of energy that can be tapped and expanded. Imagine hearing this in the 1940s and 50s, decades before mainstream science even considered such possibilities. To many, it sounded impossible. And yet, as the years have passed, studies have only inched closer to the truth Cayce spoke, that love, intention, and awareness carry a measurable transformative power. This was his way of saying that the Christ consciousness is not confined to belief, but is woven into the very fabric of reality. But Cayce also issued a warning that still echoes today. He said that humanity stood at a crossroads, and that our collective future would depend on whether we chose to awaken to the Christ within or to remain trapped in selfishness and division. He foresaw that wars, disasters, and upheavals would continue until enough souls recognized their true purpose. And yet, he never spoke with despair. His message was always one of hope, because he believed that even the smallest act of love could tip the scales. He pointed to Jesus not just as Savior but as example, the one who showed that a single life fully aligned with God can change the course of history. And then he turned that truth back on each listener, asking, "What are you doing with the Christ consciousness within you?" That question is as sharp today as it was in his time, and it leaves us with no escape. Each of us carries a piece of the answer for the future of humanity. In the 1960s, when spiritual movements were spreading across the United States, Cayce's teachings about the Christ consciousness found a new audience among seekers who were dissatisfied with traditional religion. Many young people wanted direct experience of God, not just rules and dogma, and when they discovered Cayce's words preserved in the ARE archives in Virginia Beach, they felt as if he had spoken directly to them decades earlier. He described the Christ consciousness as the highest vibration a soul can reach, a state where fear dissolves and love becomes the only law. And he emphasized that this was not limited to saints or prophets. Every human being, regardless of race, background or culture, carries this divine potential. This radical inclusivity resonated deeply in a time of social change when Americans were questioning authority and searching for unity beyond divisions. Cayce's message was that unity is not just an ideal but a spiritual fact. The Christ consciousness already binds us all. We simply have to awaken to it. But here is the extraordinary part that few expected. Cayce taught that the Christ consciousness does not remove suffering, but transforms it. He explained that trials, hardships, and even illnesses can become opportunities for awakening if they are met with faith and love. In one of his sessions that touched an entire family, he said that pain could become the doorway to discovering the eternal presence of God within. To the modern listener, this may sound almost paradoxical, yet countless people who applied his guidance testified to this truth. They found that while external problems did not always vanish, their inner strength grew beyond what they imagined possible. And Cayce pointed to Jesus as the ultimate model of this principle, enduring suffering not in defeat, but as the highest demonstration of divine love. By linking the Christ consciousness to how we face pain, Cayce gave people a way to find meaning, even in life's darkest chapters. The practical steps Cayce outlined continue to echo today. He urged people to begin each day with prayer, not as a recitation of words, but as an alignment of the heart with God's will. He taught that meditation was essential, describing it as the act of listening to God, while prayer was our speaking to Him. He asked people to carry forgiveness into every relationship, reminding them that holding resentment blocks the flow of divine awareness. And he insisted on service, not grand gestures, but small daily acts of kindness, because in those acts the Christ consciousness becomes real. Again and again, he emphasized that this awareness is not about escaping life, but transforming how we live it. These instructions were so consistent that even skeptics admitted Cayce was not inventing doctrines. He was channeling a vision of spirituality that was practical, universal, and profoundly human. And so we arrive at the heart of Cayce's most important teaching about Jesus, that Christ consciousness is the destiny of every soul. Jesus was the perfect example, but his life was also a mirror, showing us what we are called to become. This realization changes everything about how we see faith. It is no longer about waiting for heaven after death, but about awakening heaven within us now. Cayce believed that if enough souls embraced this truth, humanity would enter a new era, a time when divisions fall, fear gives way to cooperation, and the world itself begins to reflect the love of God. He warned that the path would not be easy, but he never doubted that it was possible. His words remain both a challenge and an invitation. The Christ consciousness is already within you. The only question is whether you will choose to awaken it. And if these revelations have spoken to your heart, take a moment now to share this video. Leave a comment with your reflections and subscribe so that together we can continue exploring the mysteries of the soul. Because as Cayce himself said, it is not what we know but what we live that truly matters. Imagine being in Virginia Beach in the 1930s, walking into a modest room where a man lay down, closed his eyes, and entered a trance. Those present weren't expecting theology, they were desperate for answers. And then Cayce, in one of his most impactful readings of 1932, declared that the Christ consciousness was not a distant mystery reserved for saints, but a living force already within every soul. This was shocking, because at a time when religion often focused on sin and punishment, Cayce was pointing to something transformative. Awakening the Christ within could heal bodies, restore families, and guide lives. He made it clear that Jesus was the perfect example of this awareness, but not the only one called to embody it. The Christ, Cayce said, is the pattern for every soul. Think about the weight of those words. If true, it means you already carry within you the same light that guided Jesus, and that your life's real purpose is to awaken it. Before we continue, I want you to pause and consider, how different would your choices be if you lived every day knowing that the Christ consciousness was already inside you? If this question moves something in you, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, so we can see how far this message is spreading. Cayce explained that awakening the Christ consciousness was not about following dogma, but about living principles that align us with God. He gave practical steps again and again. Start each day with prayer to set your mind toward divine purpose. Enter into meditation to quiet the ego and hear the voice within. Practice forgiveness even when it feels impossible, and serve others selflessly. These weren't abstract ideas. They were concrete disciplines he offered to people facing unbearable circumstances. During one session that changed a family's entire life, a mother worried about her sick child was told that while medical care was important, the most powerful healing came from aligning with the Christ within, expressing love, faith, and peace in the home environment. The family later testified that this shift in consciousness transformed not only the child's recovery, but their entire household. This is what Cayce meant by awakening. It is not a sudden miracle that falls from the sky, but the steady cultivation of divine awareness in daily choices, and he insisted this path was available to anyone, rich or poor, educated or uneducated, Christian or not. But here's what nobody expected. Cayce made it clear that the Christ consciousness is blocked, not by lack of religion, but by selfishness, fear, and material obsession. He warned that when we let greed or anger control us, we create barriers inside ourselves that hide the light of God. Awakening, therefore, is not about adding something new, but removing the obstacles that already cover the divine spark within. He urged people to examine their thoughts, because every thought creates an impact. Loving thoughts expand the Christ consciousness, selfish thoughts shrink it. In wartime sessions, when families begged him for hope as their sons fought overseas, Cayce reminded them that through prayer and meditation, they could extend love that would reach beyond distance, creating a field of protection. For some, this was more than comfort. It became proof, as many later described moments when their loved ones felt unexpected peace in the middle of battle. This was Cayce's bold claim. The Christ consciousness is not theoretical, it is powerfully real, and it acts when we align with it. And yet, Cayce also gave a warning that still matters today. He said the Christ consciousness is humanity's true destiny, but if we ignore it, we invite chaos and destruction. He foresaw divisions, wars, and suffering if enough people failed to awaken, but he never spoke with despair. His message was always one of hope, because he believed that even a small group of awakened souls could shift the future of an entire nation. He saw America itself as having a spiritual responsibility, not to dominate, but to serve as a beacon of spiritual awakening for the world. And he insisted that this mission could only be fulfilled if Americans lived according to the Christ pattern within. Imagine hearing that during the 1940s, when the world was in flames. It wasn't just comfort, it was a call to responsibility. Cayce's teaching remains the same today. The Christ consciousness is not waiting to be discovered in the sky. It is waiting for you to awaken it in your own heart. When Edgar Cayce spoke about how to awaken the Christ consciousness, he always returned to the same foundation. It is a process of practice, not an instant revelation. He made clear that awakening begins with daily alignment. Prayer, he explained, is how we speak to God, but meditation is how we listen. In one of his wartime sessions, he described meditation as tuning a radio. The divine signal is always present, but we must quiet the noise of fear and distraction to hear it clearly. People who applied this practice reported remarkable experiences. Some described inner peace where there had been anxiety. Others claimed they received direct guidance about choices they had been struggling with. Cayce always emphasized that this was not about chasing visions or supernatural signs, but about developing a steady relationship with the Christ within. That relationship, he said, transforms the way we live, because it shifts the center of power from the ego to the soul. Imagine being told this in Virginia Beach during the 1940s, when the nation was consumed with fear of global war. For those who listened, these words offered not just hope but a roadmap for survival through faith. But Cayce also insisted that awakening is not possible without forgiveness. He explained that every grudge, every resentment, every unhealed wound acts like a stone covering the light of Christ in us. Forgiveness, he said, is the act of clearing the path so the light can shine again. And this was not just theory. During a session that changed a woman's life, Cayce told her that her persistent illness was being aggravated by the anger she carried toward a family member. He urged her to release that bitterness, and in doing so she reported both emotional and physical improvement. This became one of Cayce's consistent themes. Forgiveness is not for the other person's sake, but for our own awakening. By forgiving, we dismantle the inner walls that separate us from God. And this was revolutionary because it reframed forgiveness from a moral duty to a spiritual technology. It wasn't about ignoring wrongs. It was about choosing to let the Christ within be stronger than the pain inflicted on us. Another crucial step Cayce taught was service. He said the Christ consciousness awakens most fully when we serve others without expecting reward. He reminded people that Jesus himself washed the feet of his disciples, demonstrating that true greatness is expressed through humility. In countless readings, Cayce told seekers that their healing and guidance would come when they shifted from self-centered desires to acts of love and service. He explained that service could be as simple as comforting a neighbor, feeding someone in need, or offering a kind word at the right time. Every act of service, he said, is an echo of Christ consciousness made visible. This principle gave ordinary people a way to embody divine awareness in their daily routines. It made awakening accessible to everyone, not just mystics or clergy. And for those struggling during the Depression or wartime, this teaching gave them a sense of purpose and dignity, even in the face of hardship. And yet Cayce also confronted the biggest challenge directly: fear. He declared that fear is the greatest enemy of the Christ consciousness, because it blinds us to the truth of our divine nature. He urged people to replace fear with faith, reminding them that every soul is a child of God. In one memorable session, he told a man paralyzed by fear of failure that his true success would come not through striving, but through surrender to the Christ within. That man later described a transformation in his life, where the very opportunities he feared losing began to open before him once he stopped resisting and started trusting. Cayce's message was consistent. Fear constricts, love expands. And awakening the Christ consciousness is the process of expanding so fully in love that fear can no longer control us. This is not just spiritual poetry, it is practical truth, as anyone who has faced fear with faith can attest. Cayce's teaching was not about avoiding struggle, but about transforming how we meet it. Cayce often said that awakening the Christ consciousness is like uncovering a light that has always been there, hidden beneath layers of doubt, selfishness, and worldly distraction. He emphasized that no soul is born without this seed of divinity, but most people live their entire lives without realizing it. In one session that deeply moved an entire family, Cayce described the Christ within as a pattern or blueprint placed in the soul from the very beginning of creation. He explained that the struggles of life, the hardships we endure, and even the mistakes we make are all opportunities to rediscover and live according to this pattern. And here is where Cayce diverged sharply from mainstream religion of his day. He did not say that awakening was reserved for a chosen few. Instead, he declared that this was the true destiny of every soul. Think of the impact. A farmer in Kentucky, a mother in New York, or a soldier overseas, all carried within them the same divine spark that Jesus embodied. Awakening it, Cayce said, was the real meaning of salvation. But what happened next surprised even those who trusted him most. Cayce explained that awakening the Christ consciousness is not about escaping the material world, but about transforming it. He said that spirituality and daily life cannot be separated. If you pray in the morning but treat others with bitterness during the day, you are blocking the very awareness you are seeking. Awakening requires consistency, living every moment as though Christ were within you, because he is. Cayce told seekers to watch not only their actions, but their thoughts, because every thought carries creative power. Loving thoughts build a bridge to the divine, destructive thoughts reinforce separation. He reminded people that Jesus did not retreat from the world, he engaged it fully, bringing divine awareness into ordinary human interactions. And Cayce urged everyone to do the same. This made his teaching radical but also practical, because it gave ordinary people a way to live their spirituality right in the middle of their daily struggles. Cayce also connected the Christ consciousness to healing in a way that continues to inspire today. He often said that true healing comes when the mind, body and spirit are aligned with divine law. In documented sessions, he told people with chronic illnesses that their bodies could improve if they awakened to the love and peace of the Christ within. He explained that disease often begins in the mind and spirit, and when those are corrected, the body has greater power to heal. For some, this guidance led to remarkable recoveries. In one case, a woman battling an illness for years reported improvement after following Cayce's advice of daily meditation on Christ's presence within her. These stories spread quickly, convincing even skeptics that there was something real behind Cayce's words. He wasn't just speaking in metaphors, he was pointing to a living power that could change lives in measurable ways. And for families struggling with fear of sickness during the Depression and wartime, this message offered hope like nothing else. Another point Cayce made repeatedly was that awakening the Christ consciousness cannot happen in isolation. He insisted that community plays an essential role. In Virginia Beach, he often encouraged groups to meet together, meditate, pray, and study not just scripture, but their own inner experiences. He explained that when people gather with the intention of awakening Christ within, the combined energy amplifies the effect for each individual. He described it as tuning multiple instruments to the same note. Together they create harmony that no single instrument can achieve alone. This teaching influenced the formation of study groups across the country, many of which still exist today. For Americans living in times of loneliness and uncertainty, these groups became lifelines, where people discovered not only friendship, but a shared commitment to living out the Christ pattern. Cayce's vision was that these communities could eventually ripple outward, transforming neighborhoods, cities, and nations. He saw the Christ consciousness not just as a personal awakening, but as the key to global renewal. Cayce also made it clear that awakening the Christ consciousness is a lifelong journey, not a single mystical event. He explained that every day presents a choice, whether to live from the ego or from the divine within. In one reading that stayed with many, he said, "The Christ is in your midst whenever you choose love over fear." Simple words, but they carried immense weight. He compared the process to building a temple, stone by stone. Each act of kindness, each moment of forgiveness, each prayer of surrender is another stone placed in the foundation of the soul. And, over time, that temple becomes the living expression of Christ consciousness. This is why he urged people not to seek instant miracles or dramatic experiences, but to stay faithful in the small disciplines. Awakening, he said, is gradual, but it is unstoppable once the heart is set on love. He encouraged people not to judge their progress by external results, but by the growing peace within. That peace, he promised, is the sure sign that Christ has awakened in the soul. And yet Cayce did not hide the struggles that come with awakening. He admitted that those who commit to this path may face trials because the ego resists losing control. Fear, doubt, and old habits rise up to challenge the new awareness. But he reminded people that even Jesus faced temptation, and that these battles are not failures. They are the proving ground of the soul. He reassured seekers that every setback can be turned into growth if met with humility and prayer. Inside this way, he reframed struggle as an essential part of awakening. Instead of being discouraged, he told people to see difficulties as opportunities to choose love again and again. Over time, these repeated choices strengthen the soul, until the Christ within shines more brightly than the shadows of fear. For those listening in the 1940s, this was a powerful encouragement. Their hardships were not signs of abandonment, but invitations to grow closer to God. Perhaps the most controversial part of Cayce's teaching was his insistence that the Christ consciousness is universal, not confined to one religion. He said plainly that this awareness belongs to every soul, no matter their tradition. Jesus, in his words, was the perfect embodiment, but the pattern exists in all. This challenged centuries of exclusivity, but it also opened the door to a broader vision of unity. Cayce foresaw a time when humanity would finally recognize this truth, and when it did, division and hatred would fade. He believed that wars and conflicts come from forgetting that every person carries the same divine spark. Awakening the Christ consciousness, therefore, is not only personal, it is the medicine the world desperately needs. And this is why he spoke with urgency, saying that the future of civilization depended on enough people choosing to live by the Christ pattern. His voice was a warning, but also a promise that awakening is possible if humanity is willing. One of the most practical ways Cayce advised people to awaken was through what he called the practice of the presence. He encouraged seekers to carry an awareness of Christ in every activity, from work to family to rest. It was not about withdrawing from life, but about infusing life with divine awareness. He told people that every meeting, every conversation, every decision could be an opportunity to express Christ. This was radical in its simplicity, because it meant no one had to wait for a church service or a special occasion. Awakening could happen in the kitchen, in the field, in the marketplace, anywhere the choice was made to love, and this democratized spirituality, giving dignity to the ordinary and sacredness to the everyday. For many Americans of his time, this teaching was liberating. It meant that God was not far away but present in every moment, waiting to be recognized. And once recognized, everything in life began to change. Cayce also tied the awakening of Christ consciousness to humanity's collective destiny. He often warned that if individuals failed to recognize the divine within themselves and others, the world would face consequences of division, greed, and conflict. But if enough souls awakened, humanity could enter a new era of peace and cooperation. He described this as a spiritual law. Consciousness shapes reality. Just as a single act of kindness can shift the atmosphere in a family, a critical mass of awakened souls could shift the destiny of nations. During the Second World War, he urged people not only to pray for victory, but to pray for the awakening of Christ within the world's leaders. He said that only when leaders govern from divine awareness can true peace be established. This teaching struck listeners as both idealistic and deeply practical. It was idealistic because it demanded transformation at the highest level, but practical because it began with the individual choice of each person. By living as if Christ were within, Cayce insisted, we contribute to a wave of change far larger than ourselves. But what happened next showed how deeply people believed in his message. Groups across America began forming study circles, inspired by Cayce's encouragement, where men and women gathered to meditate, read scripture, and share their efforts to awaken Christ within. These groups often reported powerful experiences, conflicts dissolving, healings occurring, and an overwhelming sense of unity that transcended differences of background or denomination. For many, this was the first taste of what Cayce had described, the realization that the Christ consciousness is not a theory but a living presence that manifests when people align together. These communities became seeds of transformation, and some still exist today, carrying forward Cayce's vision into the 21st century. They stand as proof that awakening is not confined to one person's mystical experience, but can become a shared reality. Cayce was also realistic about the challenges of sustaining this awakening. He explained that society is full of distractions, materialism, competition, fear, that constantly pull people away from divine awareness. He urged seekers to guard their minds and hearts, to choose carefully what they focused on, because attention is the channel of creation. He told them to replace destructive thoughts with constructive ones, to fill their minds with scripture, prayer, and uplifting ideas. He often said, "Mind is the builder." By this he meant that what we think consistently shapes not only our own destiny, but the world around us. Awakening the Christ consciousness, then, is not a passive hope, but an active discipline of thought, word and deed. It is training the soul to reflect God in every detail of life. This discipline may sound demanding, but Cayce reassured his listeners that it brings joy, freedom, and peace greater than anything the world can offer. In the end, Cayce's teaching about awakening the Christ consciousness was not a theory to debate, but a challenge to live. He pointed to Jesus as the perfect model, not so that we would worship him from a distance, but so that we would follow his example up close. Cayce's words remain as urgent now as they were in the 1930s and 40s. The Christ consciousness is within you, waiting to be awakened. Your thoughts, your actions, your forgiveness, your service, all are part of this awakening. And the future of humanity itself depends on how many of us choose to live by this pattern. So the question is not whether Christ consciousness is real. It is. The question is whether you will awaken it in your own life. If this message has touched you, take a moment now to share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to this channel, and join a community committed to living these truths. Because as Cayce reminded us, it is not what we know but what we live that matters. And in living the Christ consciousness, we not only transform ourselves, we help transform the world.